For Prince George Mackenzie.
Thank you, Chair. I'm going to spend a little bit of time speaking on Bill 41. It's an area that holds a lot of interest for me. I live in the Prince George Timber Supply area, which is the largest timber supply area in British Columbia. Takes up about 40% of BC's softwood production, or has up until this point for sure. Anyways. And I've always, and I like what I see. I'll come back to a couple of particular areas in this bill as I move forward over the next few minutes here. But how did we ever get to this stage? It was one of the things I looked at. And I've always been bewildered as to how and when we ended up having this myopic vision of a forest as being nothing more than a mere 2x4 or pulpwood. And I did a lot of research into this, and I looked back, and I traced it all the way back to 1945, the Royal Commission report that was published in 1945. And the commissioner said in that report that British Columbia should adopt, he recommended a government of the day, that British Columbia should adopt the Sustainable Yield Strategy. And at that time, in 1945, and of course the Royal Commission had taken place a couple of years before that, so this was the culmination of all the information that he got at that particular time. The input was based on the forest sector in the 20s and 30s leading up to this particular point in time. And when the commissioner recommended a sustainable yield strategy, their vision was that British Columbia had so much wood and so much forest that we would be able to harvest forests forever in a sustainable way. Rotations were 120-year rotations in the interior of the province, a little bit less than that down in the southern part of British Columbia on Vancouver Island, but 120 years. When the commissioner made this recommendation, he also said, well, just a minute, I think, I also identify that there are other values in a forest, the wildlife, the riparian areas, the water, and the impact that a forest has on this. But I don't think I need to take that into consideration in my defining what sustainable yield is. And at that time, he was speaking from a paradigm of British Columbia just covered in mature primary forests, and we would never be able to cut it down fast enough to jeopardize that primary forest. It would be in existence all the time. Well, as we rolled through 1945, and there was another Royal Commission in 55 that focused more on the administrative parts of forestry, nothing was ever mentioned about these other values of a forest until the 1975 Royal Commission. And they did reference the fact that, we're harvesting all this mature timber, and one of these days that mature timber will be gone, and that will be the advantage that we have had in the BC forest sector up until that period of time will be gone. And there was a brief mention of wildlife. There was a brief mention of other uses on the land base other than forestry at that particular time. But we carried on. And we carried on without any regard for wildlife, riparian areas, or any of these other values on a forest until the first timber supply review that took place in the late 1990s. And I hearkened back to a presentation that the chief forester of the day made to the faculty of forestry at UBC, where he said that up until the late 1990s, nobody ever talked about the riparian areas and wildlife values and all the other values on the land, and everything was considered or calculated on one rotation of forests only at that particular time. But there was another little bit in that, and the chief forester was Larry Patterson. There was another little bit in his presentation to the faculty that caught my attention. And that was where he speaks to the fact that the environmental group of the day in the early 70s was looking at the fact that their recommendations were that BC would have an annual allowable cut of around 30 million cubic meters of wood per year. Larry Patterson was suggesting that a more feasible amount of wood during that period of time would be about 60 million cubic meters of wood per year. And industry at the time suggested that, no, we should be looking at 80 to 90 to 100 million cubic meters of wood harvested every year in British Columbia. And it looks like they won out because that's exactly what we went up to. But what that did is it eliminated the amount of primary forest that we have. We started clear cutting in the 1960s in British Columbia. Up to that particular point in time, we were doing selective harvest only. Any tree greater than 12 inches would fall, and anything smaller than that would stand. And that was working quite well from the early days up until the mid-1960s. But once we started that clear-cut process, we have been clear-cutting from that day forward to now. And when we clear-cut, we eliminate all the tree cavities that are home, home to 81 species of wildlife that den or nest in these tree cavities in British Columbia. And that 81 factor is something I pulled off of a BC government website. When particularly in today's world where we have these feller bunchers that can go and cut a phenomenal amount of wood in a very short period of time, the operators don't look up. They don't look for stick nests. They don't look for the tree cavities. They just cut everything down on their path. And it's gone. It's gone forever. So what we have basically done over that period of time, we've harvested we've clear cut 20 million hectares of forested area in British Columbia. 20 million hectares. That's a lot of land. That's a lot of habitat that is missing. And I throw this question out, and I'll throw it out now, but I've thrown it out in many of the presentations that I made around the province, is what happens to the wildlife that live in that area that's going to be logged? So what happens to the raptors, the goshawks, the eagles, the owls, the marten, the fisher, and all the animals that live in that particular area? And everybody, when I generally make a comment like that, they'll look at me and they'll say, they expect an answer from me. So the answer is this, Mr. Speaker: they die. So they either die in the logging process itself, 81 species that are hiding in a tree cavity or under the roots of a tree that get crushed in the logging process itself, or if they're lucky enough to escape, they could escape into an adjacent area of forest that has adequate habitat to keep them. But all animals on the land base are territorial. They will fight to the death to protect their particular area from another one of the same species coming in. That's their food source. That's their home. It can only sustain so much life within that area. So there's a fight to the death. So there is no net increase of wildlife. They don't all move into the adjacent primary forest habitat because it won't sustain them. So many of them die. The ones that run to the other side of the area that's being logged, that has already been clear cut and has not yet provided regrowth that would sustain any habitat, and that takes 80 to 100 years in the interior of the province to grow back, they die of starvation or exposure. So our wildlife population in British Columbia has been decimated. It has probably dropped by 50 to 80% across the province. In many areas, the marten population, which is the Canadian sable, have disappeared. Fisher have disappeared. Goshawks have disappeared. Gray owls have disappeared. Great horned owls have disappeared. Mr. Speaker, over the last 7 or 8 years, maybe a little bit longer than that, I've put a lot of miles driving through the Prince George Timber Supply area, parts of the Mackenzie Timber Supply area, the Quesnel, 100-mile Lakes District Timber Supply areas, and I've been looking at the retention areas, the areas that have been left behind by logging. And I've been focused on a few things, and one of the things I was looking at was the stick nests that might have been left behind in logging. Because under Section 34 of the Wildlife Act, you can't cut down, you can't dispose of a stick nest at any given time. It's protected. Because the stick nests are what the owls will chase out the eagles and the hawks out of those nests and take them over themselves to raise their young. So I've been looking for stick nests, and I haven't found one single stick nest in any of the retention areas that I've seen in those timber supply areas. And I put on 10, 15,000 kilometers specifically driving into them. If I can't see the area with a set of binoculars that I carry, I walk into it. So that's a problem for me. And I haven't seen the tree cavities that are so important for those 81 species of wildlife. Where are they? They're logged, they're cut down. There is the odd time where a forest company will leave a wildlife tree, they call it. And they will let this big cottonwood with a tree cavity, perhaps, maybe, in it, The tree cavities are usually 20, 30, 40 feet up in these trees. Tree needs to be at least about 80 to 100 years old before it has a tree cavity, big enough to have a tree cavity. But they will leave this solitary tree in the middle of a large clear cut that no animal will ever consider going to because it's open around there. There's no habitat for it for protection. There's no food source for it in that particular area there. So all this has been happening year over year over year. And when I started researching this and when the former Premier Christy Clark asked me to do a wildlife habitat review across the province, those are the things I was looking at. But then I became quite concerned when I saw the level of clear cutting that had taken place across the province, and not only the loss of wildlife habitat that we see that has led to the 40, 50, 60, 70, 80% decline in wildlife populations, in some areas probably 100 has been extirpated. But I was concerned about the loss of tree cover. And I first came across a hydrological study that was done in the southern interior of the province by a UBC professor and a hydrologist from the Kootenays that looked at the southern interior, and they said, I think we've been using the wrong science to determine the impact of the loss of forest cover on the land base. And the research indicated that the loss of the tree cover leads to accelerated snowmelt in snow-dominated regions, which most of British Columbia is, particularly on the south-facing slopes. So with no tree cover or very little tree cover, we get massive amounts of snow falling in British Columbia like we do, thank goodness. But the spring freshet comes and the sun melts the snow in a very quick and rapid fashion that it causes flooding. And that flooding starts in the upper reaches of every watershed in British Columbia, and by the time it reaches the Fraser Basin, it starts building up. And that has led to the science that I've read over the last 5 or 6 years is making a connection between the loss of forest cover and the massive floods that we have. And the science, there's been some recent studies out this year as well that indicate that. But it goes a step further. So with the loss of the tree cover and the rapid melting of the snow that we have, once that snow is gone and once those creek beds have dried out, the sun continues to shine in the summertime and the watersheds dry out and there's no moisture retained in the watersheds themselves, which leads to a higher wildfire risk in just about every watershed that we have across the province, which is concerning. And I think it would behoove any government or any forest company to ignore that science. It's been developing over the last 15 years or so. But there's a liability attached to it if you do ignore that science. And that, from what I've read and some of the things that are occurring today, I think that, with this connection that's being made, we see loss of life because of the fires, because of flooding. We see billions of dollars in damage, and we know what's causing that. And so I think this bill is timely, and I do like the pieces of it, particularly under Part 3.1 of the bill itself on issuing cutting permits and some of the things that the minister will be taking into consideration in approving those cutting permits, because this is critical to British Columbia recognizing the entirety of a forest, not just the value of a tree for 2x4s and pulpwood, but the entire forest for its biodiversity, the entire forest for not only wildlife values, but also the hydrological values in maintaining that hydrological integrity of the watersheds that we have and reducing the risk of fires at the end of the day. So there's a number of factors that need to be taken into consideration here. When I talk about the fires, which is a worry when we see 2.8 million hectares of forest burned in British Columbia, and I watch on the news and I do some research on where these fires are, and I look that a lot of them have taken place in secondary growth. They've taken place in managed forests that have replaced the primary forests that were put in place. The rule is, and British Columbia went through a number of transitions in forest management and sustainable forestry, and we started planting the lodgepole pine as the tree of choice because it grew faster than all the other trees that we had tried. And we still plant some spruce and fir species as well. But lodgepole pine in the interior of the province was a species of choice. And an area that I'm familiar with, everybody probably knows that, I've been a trapper in British Columbia for 50 years. And in the area that I've been trapping for the last 50 years has been predominantly spruce and balsam. Balsam is a fir species. It's been a moist interior area of the province and has been replanted with pine. And the primary forest that I've been used to, and my baseline stems from over 50 years ago when I was first getting into trapping and hunting and fishing and whatnot, is, it was a forest populated with mature trees that had about 300 stems per hectare, 400 stems per hectare. So they cut all those trees down, and industry says that we are planting 3 trees for every one that we cut. And I questioned that. I said, is that a good thing to do? And when you look at it, we're getting industry planting 1,500 stems per hectare on average in a lot of these clear cuts that are produced. And then we look at the natural regen trees that might start growing up in these same areas. And I walk into them, and I'll show people, we'll walk into this regen area of freshly planted pine that might be 10, 15, 20, 30 years old. And the understory is missing. There's no understory in these plantations. It's probably 6 inches deep of dried pine needles and dried pine cones. And there's nothing else. There's no broadleaf plants in there because we use glyphosate to kill it prior to replanting all those trees. That makes it impossible to do any prescribed burning. And I see sections in this bill where they talk about cultural burning and First Nations input into that. That might have worked in a world prior to clear cutting where we had regulated burning and where we practiced cultural burning, where it generated the understory and the biodiversity and provided the animals for harvest and the fur bearers for harvest and was beneficial for everything on the land base, including the blueberries and the huckleberries and the mushrooms and plants like that. But as we have mowed down and cut down the 20 million hectares of primary forest in British Columbia and replanted it with dense populations of monoculture conifers, we have eliminated that option for us. There is no way that we can control a fire in these monoculture plantations. They will take off. They're planted so densely, they are so dry that it's impossible to do that. So we need to integrate and bring back the cross or the mixed force that we had with a good population of deciduous growth in there, the aspen, the cottonwood, the birch, and all those kind of plants that help the ground retain moisture in those particular areas. So, that's, and I see that opportunity is going to exist, Mr. Speaker. And I go back to this particular section that I talked about under this bill, where it talks about issuance of a cutting permit, and under section 5203 it says, without limiting the minister's discretion under subsection 1 to consider other matters, in deciding whether to issue a cutting permit, the minister must consider the impact that timber harvesting under the cutting permit and road construction in relating to the cutting permit would have on A, the management and conservation of forest resources. Outstanding. I'm really glad to see that in there. Cultural heritage resources. Public health and safety and prescribed matters. So when I look at public health and safety, this is what I look at when I sit and I watch the news with every other member of this House, and watching the massive floods that take place as a result of the atmospheric rivers that come through that end up flooding our highways and cutting off access to parts of British Columbia. That's a public safety issue. And this latest science, this hydrological science from the UBC Faculty of Forestry Hydrology Department, Professor Eunice Alilis has done a lot of work in this particular area with other hydrologists in the province as well, and he's linked that. They have linked that situation where the loss of forest cover has contributed to these mass flood events that we see in the province. So I think this is something that the minister will obviously be taken into consideration, and there's other sections in here as well where industry has to go to the experts and say, what about these things here? What about this work that the UBC Faculty of Forestry has done that says this? how do we, is this right? How do we risk that out? And that is a determination that the forest industry has used for as long as I can remember. I've liaised with the licensees up in my particular area for the last 30, 40 years over cutting permits and operational plans and whatnot that they have there. And I was always thwarted by their response. I would say, what about the fact that, we've killed off all the goshawks in the area? What about the fact that we don't have any moose left? What about the fact that we don't have any marten left? And their response now, when I go to them, is, well, legislatively we can do it. So there's nothing stopping us because the legislation allows us to do it. So now when I see this coming into place, this is a tool that myself and other tenure holders on the land can say, okay, well, what about this? How are you going to address these particular issues here? And it's, companies have taken me to task before and they say, well, how do you know that we've lost all this wildlife in the province? They said, well, number one, it's where are they going to eat and live if we've destroyed 20 million hectares of their habitat? But when I look at moose, which is a predominant species throughout the province, was at one particular time, and I looked at all the data on moose harvesting in the province, and moose are reliant on our forests, on a mixed forest. In 1997, we harvested roughly about 14,000 moose in the province of British Columbia. In 2021, we harvested just under 4,000 moose in British Columbia, despite the fact that we are now selling 4 times more harvest licenses for moose than we did in 1997. And when I look at the fur returns for the trappers across the province here, the fur returns have plummeted. At one particular point in time, we used to see, the fur depot in Prince George would bring $2 to $4 million worth of raw fur through the Prince George Fur Depot every year. Today, that number has dwindled down to a few $100,000 at best, just because the wildlife isn't there. The species are no longer there available for us to use. So when we look at a forest, and this may be the start of a change, but when we look at the forest, we need to understand all the values of a forest. We need to understand that it's more than a mere 2x4 or pulpwood. And jobs are important, and jobs have been important all along. But when I look at the fact that the GDP for forestry in British Columbia will be less than 1%, probably this year, maybe next year, it was 1.8% in 2020. It was around 4% in 1997, so it's dropped significantly from that period of time. Employment levels have dropped from well over 100,000 to, maybe 20,000 across British Columbia directly involved with the forest sector. So when we look at this, and we look at the fact that we are out of harvestable trees across the province, this may be the time to make those adjustments so that we have the least impact on those types of things that we see. There's another study that I looked at, and it was a collective of literature that international scientists from around the world looked at to determine the impact of primary forests on continental weather, on regional weather patterns and whatnot. And the study indicated that, the coastal rainforest that many continents have is responsible and directly related to the amount of rainfall that you get internally within the continent. So the weather patterns coming into British Columbia and passing through and over the coastal rainforest that we have in British Columbia are directly responsible for the amount of precipitation they get in Alberta, Saskatchewan, Manitoba. And so it's got wide-reaching impacts. The other value, though, that we have when we talk about climate change in British Columbia and rising temperatures, what are the evapotranspirational values of a forest? And those need to be taken into consideration, and I hope that will be part and parcel of what this bill addresses here. So how, a tree, a large mature tree, will take up 250, 350 liters of water in a day. And then it transpires that water during the evening hours, and it evaporates, and it forms the clouds, and it forms rainfall, but it also keeps that forest, that primary forest, cool. So you can walk, from your front lawn into a forested area that's completely covered, and you can feel the difference on a hot day. Well, that's what these forests do, is they regulate that temperature range. And there was a report that came out in 1986 done by the Fish and Wildlife Branch, and they looked at the impact and the densities of the marten population. Of course, as a fur bearer, I was interested in that. And they determined that clear-cut logging that not only eliminated the habitat for that particular species, but it also raised the temperature on the ground so that the peltage animals, the animals that had fur, could no longer survive in that particular area because the temperature on the ground was hotter than they would normally tolerate. So they kept going into the deeper density parts of the forest that we have. And so that was a significant impact for those particular animals. There's also a research study done by Dr. Jeff Werner out of Prince George, works for government, a wildlife ecologist, that has determined that the amount of protein available for ungulates in the feed that they have in a clear cut is insignificant to support them. So the research has indicated that the further away that you get from the edge of a forest into the middle of a clear cut, the less protein value is in the feed that they use. They could virtually starve to death with a full belly of their normal food, the poplar and the alder and the birch and the other food that they eat there. So all of these have implications that have never been properly considered in the development of operational plans for forestry. And they need to be taken into consideration for those operational plans. So the total value of a forest is not just a 2x4 and a job. The total value of a forest needs to take into consideration all these other factors in order to make it work properly. This is the era. You know, we have been a generation, 2 or 3 generations of politicians that have supported the sustainable yield strategy since 1945. This is the time to change. If we want to have mature or primary forests that provide, that mitigate climate change, that mitigate floods, that mitigate wildfires, that help us use natural means to mitigate all of those factors so we're not re-engineering our highways and our cities and our towns, we need to look at the complete forest and all the values that the complete forest will provide the people of British Columbia for generations and centuries to come if we change how we do that today. And we need to do that today. When you look at the fact that, you know, there's a lot of discussion around old growth logging, if you cut down these 3 and 4 and 5 and 600-year-old trees, they are gone for 3 and 4 and 5 and 600 years. And people will say, well, you know, walk away from it and it's gone now. Now what do we do? Now is the time to retain what we have and look at a new way of doing business, have everybody sitting down at the table, following the legislation and entertaining all of the values on the land to ensure that all the factors are considered moving forward. So I'm going to have a closer look through this bill, Mr. Speaker. It's got some interesting things in it, and I'm sure that during the committee stage, when we pop the hood open on this, we will put the minister to the test and fully task him with trying to provide the answers for that. So I like what I see so far on this bill. Thanks very much for the time, Mr. Speaker.